time, I would like to formally welcome everybody to our webinar this afternoon and hand it over to MP Avery. MP is the facilitator for the English Language Learners Alliance here at RAL Northeastern Islands. MP, over to you, and have a great webinar this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Peter, and good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to this webinar on mathematical thinking and communication, access for English language learners, hosted by the English Language Learners Alliance at RAL Northeastern Islands. It's great to see so many of you from our Northeast region and also from across the country. We're also very glad to see quite a number of teachers joining us today, as this session is really geared very much to what you're doing in the classroom. I know some of you have already heard this, but for those of you who are just signing in, I would like to share with you a little bit about our English Language Learners Alliance. The goal of the English Language Learners Alliance is to work with our member states, districts, and schools on using data to better understand who our English learner students are, the unique experiences they bring with them, and how best to meet the diverse strengths and needs. In promoting our work, we have developed a number of resources, research studies, and tools that help us meet our goals. You see two of these publications that are available on our website. And also we have some works in progress that will be looking at the predictors and consequences of reclassification for English language learners in middle and high school. And we've also developed a tool that will allow districts to do a self-assessment on the quality of the data they gather through the home language survey. Our agenda for today, as you can see, is we've done some welcome and introductions. Johanna Nikula, who's one of our presenters, will be giving a brief overview about the overarching ideas and research that will serve as the basis of this presentation. Then we will have an opportunity for you to engage in experiences thinking about visual representations of mathematical thinking for English language learners. We'll have two periods of questions and answers, but as Peter mentioned, please feel free to put in your questions in the chat room and we will try to answer them as we go along, or we'll answer them during this question and answer period. After the first question and answer period, we're going to look at language strategies. Johanna will be providing an overview of that and also providing a summary of promising practices. I'd like to remind you also that towards the end of the session, we will be putting up a stakeholder feedback survey, which we hope you will take seriously as we take the feedback that we receive to improve the webinars that we present on a regular basis. So for today's goals, what we have in mind is that our presenters will be sharing with you what the current research findings are that demonstrate the importance of language proficiency in mathematics learning among English learner students. We'll also engage you with mathematical visual representations to explore how they can be used to support mathematical reasoning and communication for English learner students. And we'll be sharing strategies for promoting language access and production by English learner students in ways that are embedded directly in the mathematical work of the classroom. Our presenters for today are Johanna Nikula and Jill DePiper. Johanna is a project director at Education Development Center, where she leads a number of projects working with teachers to make mathematical learning experiences engaging and stimulating, as well as accessible to all learners. She specializes in designing and studying models of professional development for mathematics teachers, in particular teachers working with students from diverse backgrounds and students with varying degrees of proficiency in English. Our second presenter, Jill DePiper, is a senior research associate at Education Development Center, where she is working on initiatives focused on deepening mathematics teachers' understanding of effective instructional practices for students who are English learners. She brings extensive experience in research design, instrumentation, and analysis. So without further ado, I'd like to turn over the webinar to Johanna. Johanna?
Thanks, MP. I'm Johanna from EDC, and we're really excited to talk to you today some about the work we've been doing here to support teachers of mathematics who work with students who are English learners. I'm going to start out by talking about some of the overarching ideas that are behind the work we're doing, and then you'll have an opportunity to experience some of those ideas. So first I want to talk a little bit about where this work started. So about a decade ago, we were going to work with mathematics teachers in New York City around habits of mind and ways of thinking in mathematics. But the teachers we were working with had large populations of students who are English learners. And so we ended up collaborating with some experts in working with students who are English learners like Harold Astorius at Lawrence Hall of Science, and Mark Driscoll, our colleague at EDC, was involved in this work as well. And one of the first things that we heard that really resonated with us was something that Maria Santos, who at the time was the director of the New York City Office of English Language Learners, said. She talked to us about how for English learners to succeed in learning mathematics, they need to be more productive in mathematics classrooms, reasoning more, speaking more, writing more, drawing more. This really resonated with us because this idea of doing more in the math classroom is exactly what we want for all students. And so taking on the challenge of thinking about how to support students who are English learners to do so was something that was really of interest to us. So since then, we have been involved in several large projects funded by the National Science Foundation and the Institute of Education Sciences at the Department of Education to really explore developing and studying professional development models that can help mathematics teachers in their work with students who are English learners. And that's what we'll talk more about today. So on this idea of supporting students to be productive within the mathematics classroom, it's really important to think about how mathematics and language are intertwined with each other. So I have here on this slide a quote from Bill Barton in The Language of Mathematics, where he says that mathematical concepts, objects, and relationships arise through language and within particular sociocultural environments in response to human thinking about quantity, relationships, and space. So there's a couple of important things related to this quote. One is this importance of language in developing mathematical thinking. So the two go hand in hand, and students, we can't just take out the language and do the math. The two are intertwined. And then also I want to point to the end of this quote where it's talking about the mathematical thinking related to quantity, relationships, and space. Something we'll be focusing on in today's session is visual representations and how they can support English learners. And part of why visual representations are so helpful is because they provide space for representing things about quantities, relationships, and space. So you'll see more about that as we go on. So I've mentioned how Maria Santos talked about the needs of students, that they need to be able to be more productive in the math classroom, and how mathematical thinking and language are intertwined. And then we need to think about what does that mean for what teachers do. So Judith Moczkiewicz talks a lot in her work about how learning mathematics involves participation in the mathematical discourse practices in a classroom or other mathematical learning community. So we need to think about what we can do as teachers to support students in the classroom so that they can participate in these discourse practices. So that's what we'll be talking about today. So in particular, I want to step back for a moment and look at the standards for mathematical practice, which you may be familiar with. These are part of the Common Core state standards, although even in states where the Common Core state standards for mathematics have not been adopted, many states have been using versions of these mathematical practices. So the mathematical practices are meant to articulate ways of thinking that students should be engaged in when they're in the mathematics classroom because they are part of the work of doing mathematics. What I've done in this slide is I've highlighted in red the verbs in each of these standards for math practice because this is an interesting lens on what it means to engage in mathematical practice. So you see make sense, persevere, reason, construct, critique, model, use, attend to, look for, express. So you can see the act of being in the math classroom is a very active form of participation, and this is why we need to support ways for students to really engage in the mathematical work. Given all that, there are three main principles that are behind all of the work we do and the research we do. And I will overview these, and then when we look at an example activity, you can be thinking about how these play out. So one is about engaging with challenging mathematical tasks. In all of our work, we feel the most important thing is to make sure that students who are English learners, along with all students, are having opportunities to engage with challenging grade-level mathematics. We want to make sure that in making things accessible, that doesn't mean we're watering down the mathematical opportunities for students. In order to do so, we feel it's really important to integrate support for language access in production. So the issue of language is not something to be addressed separately or in a different class for students. It needs to be right during the mathematical work of in the classroom. And finally, we focus on supporting and using multimodal representation. So this means using many different modes of communication. And in particular, we focus on the use of mathematical visual representations, which I alluded to earlier when I talked about how they can represent quantities, relationships, and space. So we're going to look at some examples of how these visual representations can support students or English learners both in doing mathematics and talking about mathematics. So I mentioned at the bottom of this slide an article where we give more examples of these three principles. And if you go to the NCTM website and just Google my last name, you will find it. It's an article about supporting English learners' lessons from research. I'll also say that all of this work and these principles where we have been implementing them are mostly in middle grades classrooms, working with middle grades teachers. So the examples you'll see are focused on the middle grades. However, the principles and the ideas behind them could apply for all grade levels. So with that, actually before I transition to Jill, I did want to say a little bit more about what I'm talking about when I say visual representations. So visual representations can mean a lot of different things. We're talking about in the context of mathematics in particular, where geometric drawings or mathematical diagrams can support English learners' mathematical thinking. They lead to solution paths. They are used with language strategies integrated, and not only do they support the students, but they also help teachers to learn more about what students are thinking, which then supports teachers to better serve those students. So Jill will walk us through a classroom activity to give us a sense of what this looks like.
Thanks, Johanna. So now I'm going to share an example of a classroom activity that uses a visual representation. This activity is called Sara's Candies. As we're going through this activity, I'd like you to think both as a mathematics learner and as a mathematics teacher, or as someone who would use this task in instruction. In this way, you're thinking about the mathematics you're engaging in as well as the mathematics or communication someone else would engage in. You can take notes about what instructional moves you notice for supporting mathematical thinking and mathematical communication as well. Here's the task. I'm going to give you a moment to read it to yourself, and then I will read it out loud. Sara had a bag of candies. She gave 1/3 of the candies to Raoul. Then Sara gave 1/4 of the candies she had left to Jasmine. After giving candies to Raoul and Jasmine, Sara had 24 candies left in her bag. How many candies did Sara give Raoul? In this task, one of the first things we want to think about are what are words and phrases that you anticipate students may struggle with in this task. One phrase you'll notice is the phrase had left and left in her bag. Move my cursor, here we go. Oops. The phrase had left in this case is talking about the remaining candies, or candies she had left in her bag after the task, rather than left as a direction. Another point we want to make is that in designing this task, we consistently use the word candies. So the word candies here is about a bag of candies, and later we talk about she gave 1/3 of the candies. And this was instead of referring to a bag of candy, and then later referring to a bag of the candies she had left. These are considerations to think of when you're writing tasks or reviewing tasks for English learners, trying to think about in what ways you can prevent different language from getting in the way of students' mathematical reasoning. What I'd like you to do now is begin your diagram. In reading the task, the question, it again says, Sarah had a bag of candies. She gave a third of the candies to Raul. Then Sarah gave 1/4 of the candies she had left to Jasmine. After giving candies to Raul and Jasmine, Sarah had 24 candies left in the bag. How many candies did Sarah give Raul? Please take this time to create a diagram to help you solve the problem. We'll give you just a few minutes to do this. As you are working, representing the important information could be a good place to start. And we certainly know you will not complete the diagram at this time, but just begin. I'm going to have us move to the next slide to discuss what you could have created. I'm offering this poll here. Here the question says, which diagram is most similar to what you started? Please review the options and make a selection. We'll then discuss some of these diagrams as well as what you chose. I'm impressed that we have a few people who chose E. So as I see these numbers coming in, I want to make sure to note that there is not a right answer here, and different diagrams can support mathematical thinking. It's very important to use the diagram that makes sense to you, as well as when you're engaging students in doing diagrams, looking at the diagram they created and help them make sense of it or help other students make sense of mathematical thinking using diagrams. But I did want to talk about a few of these. First, what you'll notice is that all 6 of these here, wow, no one chose F. All 6 of these here represent a full bag of candy in some way. So for example, in D, the full bag of candy is represented by the whole circle. In E, that's noted there. A and B both represent the full bag, and C by the largest rectangle. And all the diagrams here represent quantities differently. For example, if we look at diagram C, you can see where the largest rectangle is representing the full amount of candy. Jasmine's candy is represented as the small green square, which is taken from, which is a fourth of the 4 on the right. And the third is Raul's here on the left. I was noting that there were a few that chose E. E is a great diagram in some ways because it shows the bag of candy with a branching diagram. And branching diagrams are used in probability and statistics and can be a different way to show this algebraic reasoning as well. After allowing students time to create a diagram, or in this case, your time creating the diagram, it's important to share and discuss your diagrams. In a class situation, you can have small group conversations or full group conversations about a diagram. And in this slide here, I'm sharing a few sentence starters that we are going to use in order to prompt our conversation about diagrams. Sentence starters can allow students a way to frame their ideas, as well as from an instructional perspective, they can help a teacher focus on what they want a student to share. Here's the first diagram we're going to use the sentence starters to discuss. In black, you can see the started part of the sentence starter. And this one says, this diagram represents Sarah's candy at the beginning by the whole circle. It's also important to note that in this diagram, the student highlighted a hidden relationship through the diagram. The second sentence says, my diagram shows that Sarah gave away half of her candy. I'd like to discuss the way this is shown by going through the steps of the problem. So Sarah had a full bag of candy represented by the whole circle. And then took that third away and shaded in Raoul, then divided what was remaining into 4 equal pieces, and 1/4 was given to Jasmine. The circle diagram represents that half well by showing in green what Sarah had left. This next diagram has, we also completed 2 sentence starters. This diagram represents the candy left after giving candy to Raoul by the red bracket. A student then responded to say, this diagram helps me because it shows that Jasmine and Raoul had 24 candies together. If a student had shared this, you could prompt the student to share more about what they meant. Can you tell me more about your diagram? A student may share how he or she divided the section, the entire rectangle, into 3 pieces and shaded a third green, and then divided what was left into fourths and shaded a 4th red. The brackets on the left show the 24 that Sarah had left, and then the student was able to reason about the 24 that Jasmine and Raoul had together. We have 5 ideas here that talk about how visual representations support students' mathematical reasoning and communication. And they were represented in our activity here, as well as we think can be used across other activities. A visual representation can help students start their work on a task by representing the important information. A student can also use a visual representation to think about a specific mathematical question, or it may help them see other questions. And a visual representation can be an artifact that supports a student's mathematical thinking or mathematical approach and allows them to share more about their reasoning. We also wanted to note that visual representations can be used to support productive and receptive language use. They support students' production of specific mathematical language. For example, if you wanted to have a student use the word represent or quantity or talk about something that was left. A visual representation can also be a way to prompt students to use certain terms or phrases or discuss a problem or a context and give more information there. We are now on to questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So at this point, I don't see any questions in the chat box, but let's take a few minutes, and I see a few people are typing. So we'll wait and see what your questions are, and then we can read them out and have Johanna and Jill answer them. Okay, I can see multiple attendees are typing. They're probably all going to pop up at the same time. Okay, so the first question, how do we bring this to the high school level of mathematics? Jill?
Yes, I would say for high school students and for high school mathematics, we really want to have students able to talk through their mathematical thinking. If I look across what we suggest as the common core practices for mathematical practice, what we really want are those ways students are justifying their thinking and communicating mathematically. Mathematics is a process of making sense, and in this way, the diagram can be a way that students are communicating their thinking or making justifications. The task about Sara's Candies is one that I think crosses over grade levels and can have different ways of supporting students and then representing this algebraically. When students can represent with a diagram, it can then be the next step to concretize some of that abstract thinking that we would like to see.
Great. Okay, thank you. And if, as Jill and Johanna answer the questions, if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to put them in the text box, and I'll try and keep the thread of the conversation. But we do have another question from Angela. When do I know to graduate from visual representation?
So that's an interesting question about graduating from visual representations. My first instinct is to say that I don't think it's a first step and then you necessarily graduate from them. We think visual representations can always be useful. But what's important is to make connections between visual representations and other more abstract representations to support understanding of those more abstract representations. So we're not thinking of it as a scaffold that's needed at the beginning and then you graduate for them, but they're actually a problem-solving tool that can be used throughout mathematical work, including for mathematicians. Jill, would you add anything to that?
No, I think that's great. I think we want to think about the multiple ways we represent mathematics at all levels. And I understand that it takes time to represent mathematics this way, and so it feels like we need to move from that to more algebraic representations. But I think we know that mathematicians and people who use mathematics in engineering or in science are continually building on other ways besides numerical or representations.
Great, thanks. There are lots of questions coming in. We might not be able to get to them all in a few minutes, but we will keep track of them, and we have another chance for questions at the end of this webinar. There's a question from Teresa Lara Meloy. Hi, Teresa. She says, I think that this task could help students developing their own diagrams and representations. Do you expect the same level of engagement with representations for graphs or tables or equations?
This is Johanna here. So this is definitely, we think about this task as something that can be used for students. And just to clarify around that, we actually use this kind of task in the work with visual representations both in teacher professional development settings where teachers are doing the creating of visuals, but also with students in the classroom. Teachers have students create them. So I do want to affirm what Teresa is saying, that is certainly one of the affordances of this. And then in terms of thinking about graphs, tables, equations, yes, we would support and encourage the same kind of engagement around these. I think it goes back to this issue of we need to support English learners and all students to be productive in the math classroom, which means having these mathematical discussions around whatever the representation is, whether it be an abstract representation or a graph or a table or one of these mathematical diagrams or a geometric drawing.
I think another piece I wanted to add is about this idea of getting started and where representations fit. It kind of goes to what you just said, Johanna, as well as the piece about when we use them. And I think that the idea of students not knowing where to start, and there's another sort of related question about, do you do a mini lesson on diagrams? And I think that's true. Not knowing where to start is something we need to teach students. How do you get started? You'll notice that when we did this, I only gave you a few minutes to get started and begin a diagram. And part of that is because if students don't get started and don't know how to begin a diagram, you don't want to leave them to be working for 15 minutes. What could you draw? Sometimes with this Sara's Candies task, we see students draw a bag of candy, a bag that has a little string on it, and they get started and draw one thing. And that's great. That's actually a way to engage with the task. That's part of Math Practice 1 about persevering and getting in to the task. I also think that what we want is to think about what our students need. Maybe they have an idea about how to diagram some element of the task. If it's about candy, they end up drawing a Jolly Rancher or a Tootsie Pop, and that's a way to get started. And then you say, hey, okay, well, what would the next step be? And having those sorts of conversations allow students or English learners participate. you can take a task like this Sarah's Candy one we had and move it to being algebraic and say, I have 1 minus a third, so that equals 2/3. As soon as you move to that sort of talk, you may lose students who are English language learners, and instead of thinking about relying on a visual representation, you may keep more students engaged in the mathematics, as well as keep more students engaged in mathematical thinking and communication.
Great, thank you. And I have a sort of related question from Juan Platten. How do we build on the cultural aspects of the students?
Yeah, this is Jill. My response to that would be, I think you need to see what students are doing first. I think the idea is looking at what students engage in when you ask them to draw a visual representation is always the first place to start. So this is the way to bring out students' cultural backgrounds in their mathematics knowledge and understandings, and then build from there. It also is important to make sure your task would make sense to whoever your population is. That would mean that it would make sense that this problem about a bag of candies could be a good task in some areas and may not for others. A problem about rows of corn plants may not make sense in the inner city, and I think those are some obvious ones. We had some great conversations when teachers have learned about their students through what they drew or the questions students asked when they participated in the diagramming themselves. Students may ask these questions, and opening up the space for students to respond has been really interesting. I'm reminded of when we had teachers who were surprised that their students didn't know what a town was because they lived in a city. And so even those sorts of things that come out when you ask students to diagram or engage in a task makes a lot of sense.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question during this time period. And this comes from Dina Silvaggio. How are standardized tests adapting to EL English learner populations, and what about plain English tests for English learners? I'm not sure if this is something that you guys would be willing to answer at this point.
We don't know a lot about that topic. I know it's a big issue, and it's something we've heard a lot about, how that's an issue that's being faced. What are the tests that students are going to have to take? But what we're really focused on is how to support the learning of the students within the classroom, and we don't know as much about the standardized tests.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I think with that, we're going to move on to the next section. And as I said, we do have another round of questions at the end of the webinar, so keep typing your questions in, and we'll be pulling them aside and making sure that we get to them all before the end. And so I think Johanna is now going to continue.
Thanks, Carrie. And yes, I'm loving all of your questions and wish we could respond to all of them now, but we'll keep getting back to you. But we do want to take some time to really focus in on language support in particular. So we've been talking about the importance of visual representations. And at the beginning, I talked about how we need to integrate support for language. And so I want to give some examples of the types of strategies we're talking about when we talk about integrating language strategies. So there's language access and language production are both part of what we're focusing on. And so language access is the idea of making sure students understand the language enough to participate in the mathematical classroom. And then language production is focusing on how to provide enough support or scaffolding that students can participate in the discourse in the classroom. It's also important to note that we're not just talking about vocabulary. We don't just need students to learn particular words. We need them to be able to communicate their mathematical ideas. Sometimes this may be using informal language, sometimes it's using mathematical language, but we need to give them the support so that they can communicate those ideas. So then I'm going to talk a little bit about these 4 examples and then give you a chance to weigh in on which of the 4 you see as most readily useful in your classroom teaching. And so one of them is the 3-read strategy. Some of these may be more or less familiar to you, and so I'll give a quick overview of each. The 3-read strategy is one that's used typically with a word problem and then involves reading the problem 3 times before working to solve it. And so in the 3 readings of the word problem, there's a different focus each time. So the first time students are asked to focus on what is the story context. So they're not worried about the math yet. They're just thinking about what is this problem about, and getting to that kind of vocabulary about what's the context. The second time, they just need to focus on identifying what's the question or what's the task I need to do to solve this problem. And then the third time they hear the task, they're just paying attention to what's the important information that's given in this task that I might use. So that's one strategy, the 3 reads. Then there's a Frere model, which is used frequently outside of mathematics, but also can be quite useful in mathematics. And it's a graphic organizer where students are asked to identify for a particular concept, let's say area, for example. They work to identify a definition of that concept, characteristics of that concept, examples, and non-examples. And then there can be all sorts of different forms of sharing and discussing around what students put into that graphic organizer. Then there's a co-constructed word bank. I'm sure most of you are familiar with word banks as a place that vocabulary and phrases are collected. What we particularly are emphasizing here is the co-constructed nature that a word bank can have. So we support teachers in using word banks in the context of working on a particular mathematical task where both the students and the teachers are contributing words and phrases to that word bank that are meaningful to them for work on that task. And so this is where an example like what Jill mentioned of the word town coming up. If students are contributing words that they find confusing to the co-constructed word bank, the teacher learns something about what they're understanding or not. And they can also contribute words they think will be helpful in working on the task. Then there's sentence starters and frames, which you're likely familiar with as well. And these are sentence stems. Jill gave a few examples in the last activity that students complete to express their mathematical thinking. So let's do a quick poll now and see which of these 4, if you were going to pick one to be the most useful to you, you would say is most useful in mathematics teaching. So I see the 3 reads as an early lead. And again, like with the visual representations, there's certainly no right answer here. Okay, so let's keep the poll running for a moment, but I'm going to start talking a little bit about this. So the 3 reads is clearly in the lead right here. And one thing I'll say is it has been a favorite strategy of both teachers and students we're working with. We've had students coming up and asking their teachers after they have been using it repeatedly in different lessons and have gotten used to using it, like, can I use this on standardized tests? And the teacher said, of course, they were used to using it in a whole class setting, but the students were asking to adapt it to their own use and thinking about it as a strategy for working with text on problems when they went to work on tasks. The co-constructed word bank, what I want to say about that is I talked a little bit about how we emphasize differently the co-construction of it, and I think that's something important to keep thinking about, the ways to use word banks in a useful way. So word banks are so often end up just something that's pasted to the wall and aren't really relied on, and so this goes back to that idea of how to really integrate these strategies with the mathematical work. A word bank is only useful when it really is integrated. So students are contributing words to it, and then in the work on the task, perhaps a few words or phrases from it are picked and emphasized to be used in the mathematical lesson, such that, like, when someone shares in the whole group, they are trying to use one of those words. So a word bank can be more or less useful depending on how exactly it is used. Okay, so let's move on and talk some more examples, in particular how they relate to the Sara's Candies task we just looked at. So I have a list of examples here. Some overlap with the ones we were just talking about and some don't. These are 4 strategies that are often integrated in our work when teachers are working with students around the Sara's Candies task. So I wanted to just play out how they look when used with the task that we were just talking about. So for Sara's Candies, the 3 reads would be used at the beginning. And if we had been in a room with all of you, we probably would have done the 3 reads, but that's a little hard to do over a webinar. There's lots of things to think about, like, does the teacher read out the problem each time? Do the students have the text in front of them? All of these depend on your particular goals for your students and the particular language proficiencies of those students. In the Sara's Candies task, the acting out and realia strategy can be used in combination with the 3 reads. So what would this look like? This means that when we read the problem for the first time, and so I say, Sara had a bag of candies, I as the teacher might be holding up a bag of candies. And this gives some access to students as to what it is that I'm talking about. Then I say, she gave 1/3 of the candies to Raul, and I would have a student standing next to me being Raul, and I would act out pouring some of the candies into Raul's hands. Then she gave 1/40 of the candies she had left, And Jill mentioned how had left is one of the really tricky phrases in this problem. Through acting out, it's a little easier to emphasize what we mean by had left, because we can show the bag that has candies left in it. So this acting out can be used with one or more of the reads of the problem, and together they provide access to students for what the text is saying. And then there's sentence starters and frames, which can be used within the partner share and within the group share. And Jill did give some examples of what those sentence starters and frames are. And so both of these strategies are primarily supporting language production because they give students a starting point for their talking, and they encourage talking about the mathematics to be happening. So by sharing in partners and then sharing in the full group, this is a language production strategy because students have multiple opportunities to talk about the mathematics. When they're in partners, everybody's having a chance to talk, and then that's also rehearsal for being able to share in the group for students who need to practice what the language is they might say about a visual representation before sharing. So that's an example of how strategies can be used for both access and production within that task. I also want to talk a little bit about the issue of tailoring strategies based on your particular students. So we've been talking about students who are English learners, but as we all know, that's not one group. Students who are English learners have all sorts of different needs and strengths, and we want to draw on those strengths and needs of each individual student. One of the things that, of course, varies among students who are English learners are their English language proficiency levels. And so we need to pay attention to what are the English language proficiency students of the English language proficiency levels of the students we'll be working with, and what does that mean for how we enact particular strategies. So for example, in the acting out in realia strategy, this is one that's really about providing access. You need to think about, is that access that the whole class needs? And so we do some acting out for the whole class. Are there English language proficiencies very low, and so we need to act out for every single one of the 3 reads? Is it just a few students who need this additional support, and so we do it with them as a small group when they break into pairs or small groups to work on the task? And then similarly, with something like the sentence starters and frames, they can be tailored based on the English language proficiency levels to support more or less complex discourse. So getting into statements that use if-then, and more complex statements can be done for students who are of higher English language proficiency levels. So I want to pull this together then. We've talked some about visual representations. We've talked some about language strategies. I want to end by summarizing a few of the promising practices that we've found helpful. And I know one of this connects to some of the discussion around questions that we were having earlier. So this first promising practice I have up here is about alternating opportunities to create and to analyze diagrams. So this promising practice has to do with how do we support students to create visual representations if they don't yet know what a visual representation could look like. And this is why we need to alternate the opportunities to create and analyze. So we don't just want to teach students how to use one particular visual representation. We want them to learn about how to use a variety of visual representations as thinking tools. In order to expand their thinking about what visual representations can look like, they need opportunities to see some examples. And so we really focus on having them analyze examples and look at the steps that a fictitious student or one of their peers or the teacher created as they created a visual representation, perhaps with a missing step or with a mistake that the students are looking for, and they're analyzing how that visual representation helped them solve the problem. This then gives them support when they're creating their own visual representations to solve problems. We also, throughout this, want to focus on the use of these visual representations as mathematical thinking tools. So there's a difference between creating a visual representation to present what you did versus creating a visual representation as you're working on a task in order to help you solve that task. And both are important, but the resulting pictures may look slightly different. And so we try to support teachers in knowing that what gets shared in the full group in a classroom lesson can be a thinking tool. It does not have to be a final presentation. And if a student shares a diagram that's not complete or that's an in-process thinking tool, that this will give other students in the class an opportunity to analyze how that visual representation is leading toward a solution. And then, as has been mentioned several times, we work to regularly integrate language production strategies right into the mathematics lessons. and constantly be thinking about where in the math lesson they fit, how they support the particular needs, and draw on the particular strengths of the students in that class. And then finally, stepping back from the classroom to work with teachers, the opportunity is to collaboratively analyze English learner student work, and in particular with both math teachers and ESL specialists involved, and really focusing on what the potential in that work is. So where do we see seeds of mathematical thinking or the starts of mathematical language has been one of the most productive strategies for working with teachers. So with that, I think we're going to transition to some more time for questions, because I know lots of questions have been coming up in the chat box. So I will, oh, wait, well, I was going to share a few resources first. Sorry about that. So I do have up here right now, and it will be in the slides that will be posted, the email addresses for Jill and I, so you'll also be able to follow up with us later if you have questions. And I mentioned a couple of related resources for anybody who's looking for other information. For example, this April, there will be a book and a professional development program being published by Heinemann that will draw on some of this work. And then there's a current research project going on here at EDC. So there's an opportunity for any of you who are in the New England area to participate in a professional development field test built on this work, and you can email either of us about that. I already mentioned the article that's on the NCTM website about supporting English learners based on some of our past research. And then we have a website that's very much a work in progress, but mathandlanguage.edc.org houses some resources that we have to offer. And so with that, I will turn it over to Carrie for questions.
Okay, thanks, Johanna. So we have a few more minutes for questions, and I have a few left from our previous time. But let me just quickly ask Bria's question, since it's related to what Johanna was just saying. Could you define the difference between language access and language production again?
Sure, thanks. That's an important question. So language access has to do with students gaining access to the language. So their understanding of language that they're presented with in the classroom, making sure that they can understand it. So this has to do with receptive language, what they're listening and reading and whether they are understanding it. Then language production is about the students producing language. So it's what they say and write and supporting them to create language. So hopefully that helped.
Okay, great. So some of the earlier questions that I'm not sure if they got answered or not. There was one question about using this diagramming with high school students, and now there's another question as well with whether it's possible to teach a mini lesson on creating diagrams for elementary students.
So yes, I definitely think that visual representations can play an important role in the elementary level as well. And I know Elham Kazemi out in Washington State has adapted some of our materials to work with elementary level teachers. So certainly at the upper grades where students are getting into fractions and rational number, there's a lot of call for visual representations there, and likely related to some of the content in the lower grades as well.
And this is a question from Rick Bartosh. It's sort of a rhetorical question, but you guys might be able to respond to it a little bit. How many teachers would be comfortable allowing multiple representations rather than teaching the one diagram that the student needs to learn?
So I think that's a great question. I can't speak to the comfort level of particular teachers, but we've certainly found in our work that by giving teachers the opportunity to explore visual representations themselves together and see the different representations that they and their colleagues create, then that often helps set, as it would anyone, make you more comfortable than facing students when they're creating different visual representations. It's just like the reasons for solving a math task before giving it to students, because the more you know about what might come up from students and can anticipate, then the more comfortable any of us could feel in having a variety of representations come up during a classroom lesson.
Okay, great. A number of these questions actually I think were asked, and then Johanna answered them in her second round of remarks. So, for instance, Denise Walston, maybe you want to expand on this a little bit, Johanna. Would the discourse in the classroom include having students explain their chosen representation and solution, and would this include helping them to make explicit connections between and among the different representations?
Yes, that's exactly what we're talking about. What we want happening is explanations of mathematical thinking. We want students engaging in critiquing the reasoning of each other, so we can go back to those standards for math practice that I shared at the beginning. So it's about getting precise in explaining their mathematical thinking, in understanding each other's mathematical thinking about the visual representations, about understanding the different visual representations enough to be able to make those connections across them, and critiquing the reasoning of each other.
And it's also really nice to see different visual representations act as artifacts for teachers to understand their students' thinking, as well as students to understand each other's thinking. So as a student presents a visual representation that someone else hadn't seen and talks around it, students can engage in different mathematical thinking, and teachers also learn about where a student started in that problem, where he or she went in their thinking, or maybe even the next best step in order to work with that student on a task or on a skill or concept.
Yeah, and I see that actually in the chat room, this conversation is continuing as well with Juan and Linda and Maria talking about this very idea that the more representations, the better, and the importance of teachers being able to learn from the student representations, just as you guys have just been explaining. So changing the tack a little bit, there was a question earlier about the 3 reads. With the 3 reads example, with the push to prepare for high-stakes testing that are timed, what strategy would you support using when time is short? These strategies are great for in-class learning, but what about assessments?
There's actually another, someone else responded to this in the chat saying how when students use these strategies first in their classroom instruction, they can bring them fluidly into an assessment into a testing situation because they've become just part of their process. I think we found that reading a task 3 times actually does not take that long, and it can give students grounding into what they're being asked for. We're not just asking them to rush through 3, don't read it quickly 3 times. Read it once. Think about think about different elements of the task as you go. Determine what you need to do. And that is all part of making sense of the problem and figuring out how you're going to persevere and what your next steps look like. We do think they flow into assessment, and we've had students use them in assessment, and teachers say, this helped me give specific strategies for my students that crossed over no matter what our mathematical content looked like.
Great, thank you. And I think we'll finish with one more question from Sadie Sanchez. What does research say about the possibility of students learning content and language at the same time?
So one thing I'll say, and then Jill can add to this, is part of the research to look at is research about cognitive load and thinking about what students are having to pay attention to and how many things they can pay attention to at once. And so we need students to be learning mathematics. Language is a support for doing that. And so we need to find ways to reduce any other cognitive load, any other distractors that are involved. And so this goes back to the idea of alternating the creating and analyzing opportunities for students. We've found that when students are analyzing examples of visual representations, it provides a support for them because it takes away the part about them having to come up with their own. And so that's an opportunity where they get to produce more language because it's taken away something else they need to do, and they get to focus more on the language. But then we also want them creating their own, and so we alternate with those opportunities to create visual representations, and there they may not have quite as much cognitive space to be doing as much talking about it, although when they get to the point of sharing about them, they will. So it's an important issue to attend to, but the two have to be integrated in order to work. Jill, would you add anything to that?
I think what you gave a very specific picture about how this works, and I think I completely agree. I think we'd say that all content learning happens through language these days. We are talking through everything. Mathematics is not different than other disciplines in that we need to communicate through language in order to have this content learned. And so it feels like students learn content and language at the same time and no matter what they're doing. And I think that in mathematics, we need to remember that we want to discuss themes and findings and ideas students have just as we would in a language arts class or on a looking at a scientific experiment, that we want to hear what they're thinking, and we can use that mathematical vocabulary in context just as well as we would in other disciplines. So I think it's a really important idea that you're bringing up, because I think that we sometimes forget that mathematics needs language as much.
Okay, thank you very much. This has been a great conversation. I'm going to turn it over to Maria Paz-Avery, who's going to close up the webinar for us.
Thank you very much to Jill and Johanna for this very interesting presentation, and also for the wonderful comments that you all have been making in the chat room. There's been a very active dialogue going on there with many great ideas. Before we close, I'd like to remind you that we have a stakeholder feedback survey. It will be up for a few minutes after the session actually ends, but we really would appreciate your responding to this survey. We do pay attention to the feedback that you give us. It's also important that we share the feedback with the Department of Education, Institute of Education Sciences, that has supported our work. And so please don't forget to do that. So just so you know, this research was supported by NSF and by IES, and their work is continuing. If you want to continue the discussion with Johanna and Jill, feel free to email them. And with that, I would like to thank everyone again for participating in this webinar. We appreciate your attendance. We appreciate your discussions. And if you have any questions or would like to know more about the English Language Learner Alliance at REL Northeast and Islands, feel free to contact myself or Carrie Parker, who works with me as the researcher on this alliance. Again, thank you for your attention, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, MP, and thanks, Carrie, on behalf of REL Northeast and Islands. Thanks for joining us today. In 2 or 3 weeks, you'll receive a thank you email from REL Northeast and Islands with a link to the webinar archive and the slides, if you didn't already download them off Adobe Connect. You can disconnect now, and have a great afternoon. Bye.